are back on the Zero Hour. This is your host, Richard RJ Eskow. Joining me now is David Dayen. You probably know David from his writing at the American Prospect and elsewhere. David is the executive editor of the American Prospect. He is the author of a previous book, Chain of Title, and he is also the author of the newly released book, Monopolized, that's with a D on the end, subtitled Life in the Age of Corporate Power, and he joins us now. So first of all, Dave Dayen, thank you for coming back on the program.
Oh, absolutely. Thanks for having me and to talk about this book.
Oh yeah, well, it's a great book. I'm getting a lot out of it, and I've long thought there was a need for something like this, which I would describe as, but tell me if I get it wrong, as how the monopolization of corporate power is affecting people's everyday lives. Is that about right?
Yeah, that's right. There actually has been a literature that's sort of built up around these issues of monopoly and concentration and antitrust law over the last few years. Matt Stoller had a book called Goliath that was about the history of this war between corporations and the people. Tim Wu, the professor from Columbia, had a book called The Curse of Bigness. And there are a number of other books out there. Jonathan Taplin and Franklin Ford did books about big tech. What I thought was missing was actually talking to people about how this really affects them. Not just as a consumer, not just in what price they pay for an airline ticket or for cable service or whatever, but as workers, as entrepreneurs, as citizens. How does the fact that we have this situation with so many sectors of our economy dominated by just a handful of corporations at the top, what does that mean for people? What does that mean for the products they use? What does that mean for the work they do and the wages they get? What does that mean for the democracy that they live in? So that's really what I wanted to explore. And fortunately, when I was doing this book, you were allowed to travel around the country without the risk of getting a deadly pandemic virus. And so that's what I did. I went around and talked to people.
So before we get into the substance of the book, which I think, as I said, is really important, I'm just curious. How did you travel? Did you? You talk a little bit about rent-a-cars and planes and things like that, but did you ever think about, getting like a camper van and just driving places? Or I guess that's question number one. Question number two: how did it feel to kind of just look around the country?
Yeah, I wasn't in a Winnebago or anything. These were specific, places that I went in the course of my reporting. What was so funny was how I was sort of introduced to monopoly in the course of my reporting on monopoly. Like it was sort of inescapable. So you mentioned rental cars. So one story in the book is that I was in Des Moines, Iowa. I was talking to farmers about big agriculture and that effect. And I was at the Des Moines International Airport, and I go in, and I'm at a national rental car stop, and I'm waiting for my car, and they say, hold on just a second. And the lady at the national counter walks over to the enterprise counter, comes back with a set of keys and says, here you go. So National and Enterprise have the same corporate parent. And apparently at the Des Moines airport, all of the keys are just in one place. And so there's really functionally no difference between the three, because Alamo is also owned by these guys. The three rental car counters are all funneled through one set of keys in a bowl somewhere. So I just kept being introduced to this sort of illusion of choice that we have, and how monopoly just keeps affecting us over and over again. I went back and I looked at the price for the exact same car at Alamo national, and enterprise, and it was different in every one because they catered to different markets. And so somebody somewhere is paying way more for the same set of keys in the same bowl from one of these rental car companies. So that was just an example, and it was just striking how that kept happening over and over again.
Yeah, I was thinking of that anecdote when I mentioned the rental car. So let's start here. Once you started putting this book together, once your travels were over, the reporting was over, and so on, and then once you finished the book, was there anything that, especially other than these, national car rental kind of anecdotes, was there anything that particularly surprised you in the process of putting this book together?
Well, obviously, reading the book now, given everything that's happened since the writing of the book, is a different experience. So, we've had the coronavirus crisis, which, if anything, is going to accelerate corporate power. And what was interesting to me and surprising to me is not quite your question, but what was one thing that's surprising upon the reread is how resonant it is. And I'll give you one example in one chapter, which is about hospital supplies. And I did a story with a guy in San Diego whose wife had cancer, and she was getting her chemotherapy treatments. And she goes in one day at the end of 2017, and she is told that they are out of IV bags and that her chemotherapy treatment will have to be given to her manually, which is something that really was done more in World War II than today. And when you think about an IV bag being unavailable, this particular hospital overlooked the cliffs of La Jolla in San Diego. So overlooked the Pacific Ocean, which is full of salt water. And she is being told that they have no provisions for salt and water in a bag, which is what an IV with saline solution is. And what you learn through the course of this is all the reasons why these shortages happen. And one of them is supply chains where they are concentrated and they happen in one part of the country. For example, Baxter, which is the main company that creates IV bags, most of the manufacturing is done on the island of Puerto Rico. And after Hurricane Maria, they shut down the factories for a while, and this had an effect on supply. So, what are we seeing right now? We see supply chains being disrupted. But the other part of this is the fact that IV bags were in short supply well before the hurricane, and it has to do with the contracting of how hospitals acquire supplies. And there are these middlemen called group purchasing organizations that sit in the middle of hospitals and the suppliers. And the nature of these GPOs, they get sole source contracts, makes it so that the slightest disruption to any production is catastrophic for these hospitals. And that's also what we're seeing right now, is the rise of these middlemen that control the PPE and control the various medical supplies that need to get to people and need to get to hospitals. So what's surprising is the resonance of that. Literally, coronavirus was not a term that I knew, or COVID-19 was not a term in existence when that chapter was written. And yet that chapter could have been written today because it's all the same issues with respect to our hospitals struggling to get these supplies in-house.
So one of the things I think you're saying, and for some reason while you were talking about the salt and water in a bag, I was thinking of Gandhi's Salt March. Well, there's salt, but we're not allowed to get it. Right. That's the kind of that was British monopolization in that case. But I think one of the lessons there, besides the resonance of it in today's situation, is that people often think of, well, at least these corporations are big, so they're resilient. But actually, the things, in terms of the things we need, I think in many ways we lose resiliency as things become more monopolized. And I take it that that was one illustration of that, right?
Yes, absolutely. And you've hit the nail on it. The lack of resiliency in concentrating where supplies come from, where products come from, who the suppliers are, is a critical factor. I go through this in the airline chapter, for example. It seems like every 2 months there's some computer glitch, and airlines get knocked offline for a little while, and a bunch of flights get canceled. And if we had a number of carriers that could handle rebooking, all these carriers that really wouldn't. But because we have 4 carriers, Southwest, Delta, American, that do about 80% of all domestic routes. And because they're so big and they actually fight with one another over rebooking, and they don't want to do it, and they try to gouge one another for it, when there's one of these technical glitches to the computer systems of a major carrier, it has cascading effects that could last days or even weeks. I give the example in the book of, on the same day a few years back, United had one of these glitches that shut down its computer system, and also the New York Stock Exchange had a glitch that shut down its computer system. And there are a lot of stock exchanges where people can buy and sell stocks. So there was very little disruption in terms of overall volumes of stocks, even though the NYSE was down. However, with respect to United, it was this catastrophic thing that lasted well over weeks, and hundreds of thousands of passengers were inconvenienced. So you see right there the lack of resiliency that's sort of built in, almost a hidden risk that is built into monopolization that really has a real effect on people.
And again, we're talking with David Dayen, author of the new book, Monopolized. And it's striking that we could have a situation where there are more options for financial trading than there are for getting on an airplane. I mean, that to me seems an inversion of the way things used to be. What are some other examples of overly monopolized industries that whose state of monopolization affects people's lives?
Sure. I think one of the ones that I was interested in reporting out in the book was telecom. So we all know that when we move to a new place, we have maybe one, maybe 2 options for cable, and for usually one, maybe one more options for broadband internet. And in some places, there are no options for broadband internet, like rural areas in particular. We have the technology to get pretty much everybody in the country wired up for high-speed internet. Much of it done through fiber to the home, which is done through electric utilities. I went to Chattanooga, Tennessee, which actually has the fastest broadband internet in the country and maybe in the world, through its electric power authority, which is a public TVA electric authority. But they're not allowed to extend that service out beyond their service area, even though people outside the city limits of Chattanooga would want it and have expressed a desire for it, because the telecom industry put a law in the state of Tennessee saying that electric utilities cannot extend their broadband service outside their service area. So if you go 3 minutes outside of Chattanooga, Tennessee, all you have is dial-up. And I heard stories from people about how they send their kids to Starbucks parking lots every night to catch the Wi-Fi so they can do their homework. So this is a legitimate effect. I talked to one lady. This was one of the most interesting stories in the book. Her husband has diabetes, and he wears a wearable device that tracks his blood sugar. And when that goes down, she can get him a piece of chocolate or his insulin medication or whatever he needs. Well, they have spotty internet service. The way she finds out is through her phone. She gets an alert when the blood sugar goes down. Well, one day, the internet just went down because it goes off and on and off and on and off in her part of rural Tennessee. And when it came back on, he had been crashed there was a 15-minute gap in the data, and his blood sugar was dangerously low. So she had to run in and get him revived, and thankfully she was able to do so. But this was entirely because she has spotty internet, because there's no way to get the high-speed internet out to her area, because the telecoms have locked down that through putting laws together through their economic power and their political power at the state level. And it's not that they don't want to have these electric utilities compete with them necessarily, because they're not providing the service out to these areas either. It's almost like they don't want anyone to have nice things because they don't want anyone to know that nice things can be had. So that I thought was a really remarkable kind of story. And there are many more in the issue in the book. We talked to people dealing with private equity. I talked to journalists dealing with the overwhelming power of Google and Facebook. We mentioned the airlines. I talked to people who were families who were victims of the opioid crisis, who have people in their family who died from it, and all the monopolies that go into the pharmaceutical industry, which I'm sure you're aware of, RJ. There are. I basically take one chapter, follow one person through one sector of the economy, and try to sort of show the relevance of that in everyday life.
And again, we're talking with David Dayen, author of the new book Monopolized: Life in the Age of Corporate Power. Before I get to that, your story about broadband and about internet access brought up a point that I think gets a lot of people don't understand, which is, I think a lot of people, if they know about the monopoly problem, and I think most people maybe have a sense of it, many people probably think it's kind of, well, it's how things worked out. It's, how economics works. It's, well, if they don't think, well, this company must have been better at it, at least they think, well, there was some competition and they won. But I think, to me, one of the points about the Chattanooga story is, no, this monopolization is the result of conscious political choices that are themselves fueled by the money and influence corporations have. So it's kind of a self-reinforcing cycle where companies get some money, they rig the laws in their own favor, and then they become more monopolistic, more powerful, and have even more control over the democratic process. Was that something you observed in your writing of this book?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, economic power converts into political power all the time. And, that telecom is a perfect example of these large corporations using that power to basically foreclose on any rivals that try to get a foothold. Another great one is banking. There's a chapter on banking. The evolution of the Glass-Steagall law, which allowed these supermarket banks to be created, is such that there was a slow chipping away based on bank lobbyists getting involved in regulatory policy and congressional policy, legislative policy, for about 30 years, until by the end, they actually performed an illegal merger. Citigroup and Travelers Insurance merged together when they were expressly not allowed to. And essentially, this was a dare to the political system to say, come and stop us, or retroactively legalize this. And, Congress and the Clinton administration opted for the latter. They retroactively made legal an illegal merger. And of course, we can debate endlessly whether that destruction of what is known as the Glass-Steagall law, the separation between investment and commercial banking, what that did in terms of leading to the financial crisis. But what we know is what happened after the financial crisis, which is those big banks started teaming up and merging again, sort of shotgun weddings put together by regulators to save failing banks by teaming them up with other banks. And so this consolidated industry got even more consolidated. And we saw this once again with pretty much the only major bipartisan bill that was passed in the Trump administration, which was a further deregulation of the banking sector, which very predictably led to a bunch of other consolidations. And so if you look at the banking sector from the 1980s to now, it's like a straight line downward in terms of the number of banks. And thousands of these applications for mergers have been given to the Federal Reserve. And the Federal Reserve has not denied one single application in over a decade for all of these thousands of bank mergers that have gone on. So that's a perfect example of the economic power of the large banks being converted into political power. And what we didn't even talk about there was the bailout, which was this privileged rescue of a sector that caused this giant meltdown of the economy and was allowed to not only be nursed back to health, but to even grow bigger.
Well, and it's David Dayen, it's been my contention that there are more parallels between the pandemic corporate bailout and the Wall Street bailout than some people might think. And what I mean by that is, while large corporations did not cause the pandemic, they didn't generate the new virus variant or any of those things. It's my contention that what they did do was, and Boeing, is one of the major offenders, but all of them, really, the airlines included. My contention, you're free to disagree with me or not, but my contention is that pandemics were a known risk, a fully known risk. I worked on a pandemic project in 2005, and I was not an early entrant in the field. Knowing that, for corporations to take so much out of, or for executives, I should say, to take so much wealth out of their corporations in the form of dividends and buybacks and so on, leaving the coffers ill-prepared for a major financial setback like this, was irresponsibility, and they should have paid the price for that. But instead, the government rescued them. So morally, there's a parallel there for me. And I don't know if you agree or disagree with that, but to me, it ties back to your theme of monopoly, because it's the large corporations that have benefited.
Yeah, I mean, I think I do agree with you. And I think it speaks to the resiliency issue once again. These companies, by leaking out money to investors, in various ways, dividends, buybacks, or in case of private equity, just taking the entire value of a company and giving it to the private equity managers. That does a number of things. Number one, it increases inequality, and this is a function of monopoly that we've seen over and over again. A lot of studies on that. It also makes the companies that are left very ill prepared to transition in any way that they have to. So in the case of retail that is owned by private equity, that is saddled with all this debt, they can't react to an Amazon coming into the picture, or to sharply reduced spending for a little while at their stores because of the pandemic. The same with Boeing, the same with the airlines. There's no cushion. There's no resiliency. There's no ability to transition, because all the money is gone. It's been given over to investors. And so I see it in a couple different ways. And one of them is that going back to that resiliency issue, this country's large corporations were ill prepared for a virus. They didn't have storehouses of PPE. They didn't have the wherewithal to transition away from in-person product delivery and into something different, at least not quickly. And so I see it in a number of different ways. And that's why I think that even though this book was written before the pandemic occurred, I think it has a tremendous amount of resonance for what we've seen over the last 4 months.
So, David Day, and I guess my last subject area to talk about in relation to your book, Monopolized, is kind of a cultural slash political one, and it's a
Mhm.
soapbox I've been on for a while. Uh, but it's this: we've had a long history in this country of visceral hostility toward government controlling us and telling us what to do. And a certain amount of that, I guess, legitimate, okay. And certainly we don't want, most people, liberal or conservative, left or right, would agree we don't want the government spying on us, that kind of thing. And yet we've seen over the course of decades, a lot of people passively accepting the fact that these powerful corporations spy on when they take their bathroom breaks, and they better not be more than 2 minutes twice a day. And we could go down the whole list. People rant and rave about government bureaucracies, and I always tell them, go call Comcast and try to cancel your subscription, and then come back and talk to me about government bureaucracy. But whatever it is, government, in one sense, because it's singular, it's easy to point at it and say, oh, that's the problem. But one of my hopes for books like yours is that it will raise awareness, public awareness, of the ways in which corporations control our lives, intrude on our privacy, take away our freedoms, so that people who would describe themselves as freedom-loving Americans want freedom from that too. Does that make
Yeah.
sense to you?
No, absolutely. I think there are two takeaways here. And one is that this really is everywhere. I mean, there are short chapters in the book on baby formula all the way to funeral homes and caskets. So we are really literally talking about cradle to the grave here in terms of monopolies. And then the second thing, the point that you made, and I think it's very important, is that when we talk about regulation, if we cut regulations in government regulations, rules that everybody has to follow, they don't go away. We will have regulation of the economy. It will either be done democratically by governments and their elected representatives of the people, or it will be done by unelected representatives in corporate boardrooms. That's who the regulation that's where the regulation will take place. It's really a binary option. The chapter that I do on Amazon shows that they have created essentially a private government for their marketplace. And they have millions of these third-party sellers on their marketplace that are essentially slaves to Amazon's private law. They have no recourse other than to obey the dictates, the mercurial dictates of a giant corporation. And so regulation is going to either be created publicly by the people, or it's going to be created privately by people who have only their self-interest in mind, large corporate executives. And we know how to fix this. I mean, we have laws on the books going back 100 years, anti-monopoly laws that we can resurrect, and we don't really even have to change many of them in order to really strike a blow against this creeping monopolization into every part of our lives. All we really need is the political will, and I think that goes hand in hand with a political movement. And one thing that we've seen over the last few years is the growing of that anti-monopoly movement. And one of my aims in writing this book is to say that's the missing piece. That's what's really needed. I have a case study at the end of the book about the nation of Israel and how an anti-monopoly movement there actually really did change the economy. We never hear about sort of Israel's domestic policy. We hear about their policy vis-a-vis the Palestinians. But their corporate policy was they were in the hands of what were known as tycoons, like these huge corporations that were interlocking and controlled every aspect of life. And there was a movement there that got rid of them. And we can do that here. That really is possible. I mean, that's the end of the chapters as you go one by one might seem bleak, but the end of the book, I think, is ultimately hopeful that there is an option here. We don't have to have rule by corporations. We can have rule by the people. We just have to build a movement to do that.
Well, that sounds good to me. And I guess that's a good place to end. My guest is David Dayen. His new book is Monopolized, Life in the Age of Corporate Power. Excellent read. I recommend it to you. And as always, Dave Dayen, thanks for coming on the program.
Okay, thank you very much.
You got it. And we'll be right back after this. I am Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.